To do business ethics well, one must learn how to do business well. To do business well, one must understand economics, because economics seeks to articulate how markets originate, how markets evolve, and how markets work. And the better one understands markets, the better one understands how we go about our day-to-day exchanges in markets, the better one can develop a business model, a business plan, a business strategy, selling a good or a service that is profitable, where you can survive and thrive, but also do it in a way that's ethical, where you can do so without harming the people who work for you or work with you. So that is why in this course we're dealing a lot with economic theory. And there are two theorists whose thinking we're going to bump into over and over again, perhaps because their economic theory intertwines with their political theory. And these two men are John Locke and Karl Marx. John Locke was an Englishman who lived from 1632 to 1704. He lived right before the Industrial Revolution hit Britain, and that has an impact on his economic theory. Because John Locke's world was not the giant factory, the giant mill. His was the world of the artisan, the blacksmith, the tailor, small-scale manufacturers who mixed their labor with things found in nature and developed private property, goods such as clothing and horseshoes and other iron products that they could sell to other people. His world was the world of the freeholder, the farmer who produced crops and sold those crops either in a raw state or processed them into finished goods. Then that became private property that he could sell to the public for an agreed upon price. So you see the economic theory here of Locke. It's when someone, whether a blacksmith, whether a farmer, any tradesman, any farmer, any artisan, mixes his labor, and sometimes her labor, with things found in nature, cloth, iron, any other form of raw material, and that develops into one's private property, which one can keep or sell based on negotiations with the market at large. You had towns, of course, in Locke's world, and in town you had people who engaged in more abstract forms of trade. You had professors, you had lawyers, and they too mixed their intellectual labors with things found in nature, things such as ideas, which don't take on immediate physical form, but they're there nonetheless. And that was sold for a good or a service. Lawyers would be paid by the case. Sometimes professors worked as tutors and they were paid by their tutees. You did not have the large-scale manufacturing that was to come. Enter Karl Marx. Karl Marx lived from 1804 to 1883, and his world was very different from Locke's world. Marx lived in the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution made many changes to the world that Locke once knew. Because what happened was you had the mechanization of agriculture. People were no longer needed as much to work the land. You needed fewer laborers on the land, and so they went into the cities and worked in the factories. Large-scale manufacturing also displaced small-scale artisans because large-scale factories can produce things more quickly, more cheaply, at greater volume. And so those artisans were displaced, and they too worked in the factories. And this led to a challenge, because you now had workers no longer producing for themselves. They were no longer mixing their labor with things found in nature, and they produced private property that they could keep and they could sell to the market. Instead, what was going on was workers were producing for somebody else. They were producing private property for the owners and the managers who owned and operated it, the mills and the factories that made up newly industrialized England. And this phenomenon repeated itself in Europe and America. According to Marx, this led to a problem. If you're no longer producing for yourself, if you're producing for another, then how does one get paid? Thousands and thousands of workers cannot sell their product to the open market. It's too inefficient. It's too clunky. So what has to happen is one must be paid a wage. In lieu of an auto worker making hundreds of cars and then being held responsible for selling hundreds of cars, the auto worker is paid a wage for his labor. And the company then takes those cars, which it owns, the fruit of the worker's labor, and it sells it on the open market. If you're a steel worker, you make steel not for yourself to sell, you make steel for your company to sell. And in lieu of keeping the product for yourself, you are paid a wage. Now, Karl Marx says that there is a problem here, because the true value of a worker's labor is not being reflected by the wage. In other words, owners and managers were underpaying, deliberately, the true value of a worker's labor. And this led to two problems. First, worker alienation from one's own labor. If you work not for yourself but for another, and you see yourself not getting true value for what you're producing, you feel alienated from your work. There is distance between yourself and your work. You're not motivated to work because you're being used. This is the source of what Marx called exploitation. And this gap between the true value of a worker's labor and the actual wage being paid to the laborer by the owner, this is reflected by the profit margin on the part of the owner. Profits of a company, according to Marx, is the result of this gap between the true value of a worker's labor and the wage paid by the owner to the laborer. So what's Marx's solution? It's this. Workers own the means of production. Workers own the means of production. If you have to pick one definition of what socialism is, it's this: workers own the means of production. If you have to pick a basic definition of what capitalism is, the foundational idea behind capitalism, it's that a worker mixes his labor with things found in nature, things found in the workplace, and that's his private property, to dispense with as he or she sees fit. Now, this sounds like an oversimplification, but keep in mind Locke's world, the world of the artisan, the world of the farmer, that did not anticipate the full impact of the Industrial Revolution. And Marx, his thinking reflected that of the early Industrial Revolution, where there was bona fide worker exploitation. But capitalism did adapt. Karl Marx had a partner who supported him, Friedrich Engels. He himself owned mills, and he complained that in the United States there'd be no revolution because workers were becoming middle class. Because you see, owners who knew what revolution could bring, who knew what this could bring, found ways, the market found ways, to have workers bridge this gap of alienation. This gap of alienation through a greater share of the company's profit, being able to have weekends off so they can rest and relax, other things which looked after the workers' welfare, where they had a greater say in the workplace and a greater share in the prosperity of the workplace. That's why Henry Ford charged his workers $5 an hour. It wasn't just to avert revolution, but also so that workers who made a decent wage could buy his cars. It's the beginning of the consumer economy. So you can see where debates about modern economics and politics originate from, because we're dealing with how we generate wealth and how we use that wealth. And since most of us work for somebody else, and our labor is paid for in a wage, instead of us keeping our private property and disposing it as we see fit, you have the question about avoiding alienation. You have the question about avoiding exploitation. You have questions about how much a worker should have in terms of the share of the means of production. One more thing about Karl Marx. The idea that workers own the means of production would be something like this. It has to be an employee-owned enterprise. You have very few of those in existence in the world today. The closest thing you have in the United States to workers owning the means of production would be something like Publix supermarkets, where the employees own it, but you have a professional managerial class running the company. Hy-Vee runs along a similar model, so does Avis Rent-A-Car. If you really want a purely Marxist idea where workers own the means of production, it would have to be a cooperative, a local cooperative, such as a farmer's market, where the farmers own the market and manage the market and collectively decide on how the market should be run. That would be very close to what Marx had in mind. The idea of state ownership of production in the name of the workers, what communist societies became. If you were to talk to socialists like I have, they would say that that's state capitalism, that the state is the owner. Workers do not own the means of production. They would insist that, socialists would insist that communism is a betrayal of Karl Marx. It's a betrayal of the Marxist vision. But there's a problem here. Karl Marx wrote page after page after page after page after page, 10,000 pages in all, on economics. And most of that was a critique of the capitalist system. The writings on socialism and communism is very, 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 very few. Marx did not articulate a complete vision as to what a socialist society would actually look like. So it was left to other generations to speculate how. And that's why you have many, 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 many models of socialism, as well as communism, which is a more radical form of socialism. And you also have many, many, many models of capitalism. So when we talk about capitalism versus socialism, the question is, whose capitalism? Whose socialism?